On a quiet morning in a village that trusted routine more than questions, a letter appeared where it did not belong. It carried no threat, no urgency, only a certainty that unsettled those who read it. Miss Marple noticed the unease before anyone named it, and with gentle patience began to observe what others overlooked. Knowing that small disturbances often reveal the deepest truths, hidden behind familiar smiles and manners. The morning gossip reached Miss Marple before the kettle had properly begun to sing. It arrived in the familiar way such things always did in the village, carried on a remark made just a little too casually, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed they were the first to mention it. Mrs. Hudson, pausing at the garden gate with her basket balanced on one hip, remarked that the postman had looked puzzled that morning, which was unusual because he prided himself on never being puzzled by anything at all. Miss Marple, who had been trimming the winter roses with careful precision, merely inclined her head and murmured that puzzlement often arrived before breakfast for those who paid attention. The post had already been delivered to her own hallway by the time she stepped inside. Yet, it was not her letters that held her interest. From the front window, she watched Mrs. Linton across the lane, standing far longer than necessary at her own doorstep, staring down at a single envelope, as though it might speak if she waited long enough. Mrs. Linton was not a woman given to lingering. She was brisk by nature, efficient in her habits, and fond of declaring that indecision was the root of most social discomfort. Seeing her hesitate now was curious indeed. Miss Marple poured the hot water over the teapot and allowed it to steep properly. She had learned long ago that one understood people best when one did not hurry them, and the same principle applied equally to tea and to thought. By the time she carried her cup to the sitting room, Mrs. Linton had disappeared inside, though the envelope remained very much present in Miss Marple's mind. It was later, as expected, that the true shape of the matter emerged. Mrs. Linton called that afternoon, announcing herself with an apology for the short notice that sounded rehearsed rather than sincere. She carried a plate of seed cake that had been cut unevenly, another small detail that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Mrs. Linton prided herself on precision. Uneven slices suggested distraction. They spoke first of harmless things, of the vicar's sermon and the disappointing state of the chrysanthemums near the church wall. Then, with an abruptness that did not match the gentle tone of the visit, Mrs. Linton produced the envelope from her handbag and laid it carefully on the table between them, aligning it with the edge as though straightness might lend it innocence. "It is nothing, of course, Mrs. Linton said, smiling too quickly. Almost certainly a foolish joke. Miss Marple lifted the envelope only after allowing a moment to pass. It was heavier than it needed to be, though it contained only a single folded sheet. The address was written in a neat, deliberate hand. Not hurried, not careless. A hand that wished to be understood. The name upon it had not been spoken freely in the village for years. It belonged to a man whose memory lingered like a closed door no one cared to open. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Linton did not say the name aloud, choosing instead to gesture toward it with one finger, as though touch were safer than speech. The ladies who joined them shortly after behaved exactly as Miss Marple expected. Each insisted, with varying degrees of cheerfulness, that such things happened everywhere now. People had too much time, too little sense, and an unfortunate fondness for stirring discomfort. Yet each smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, when Miss Marple asked whether anyone recognized the handwriting. "No," said Mrs. Carter too quickly. "Certainly not," added Mrs. Green, though she leaned closer than necessary to examine it. Miss Marple listened more than she spoke. She observed the way voices softened when the subject turned away from the envelope, and tightened again when it returned. She noticed that one lady stirred her tea long after the sugar had dissolved, while another left her cup untouched entirely. When at last she examined the envelope herself, she did so with the calm thoroughness of someone assessing a familiar problem. Holding it to the lamplight, she saw what others had not thought to look for. Beneath the fresh ink lay the faint impression of earlier writing, pressed deeply enough into the paper to leave its memory behind. Someone had written this address before, slowly, perhaps repeatedly, as though practicing. The letter inside was brief. One sentence, carefully composed. Yet within it lay a detail so precise, so quietly intimate, that Miss Marple felt the room change around her. It was the sort of knowledge one acquired only by belonging, by having stood in the right place at the right time, listening when others assumed no one was. Conversation faltered. Mrs. Linton folded her hands tightly in her lap. Miss Marple returned the letter to its envelope and placed it back on the table, aligning it once more with deliberate care. Later, when the visitors had gone and the light had softened into evening, Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts. She reflected on the envelope's placement atop the Morning Post, too deliberate to be accidental. On the steady hand that had written a name most preferred to forget. On the way Mrs. Linton's voice had changed, just slightly, when Miss Marple mentioned the lamplight. She poured herself another cup of tea and allowed herself a small, private sigh. The village had always believed itself peaceful, and in many ways it was. Yet peace, Miss Marple knew, was not the absence of disturbance, but the careful arrangement of it. Someone had reached back into an old silence and disturbed it on purpose. As she extinguished the lamp and prepared for bed, Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Not with pleasure, but with recognition. Certain patterns repeated themselves wherever people lived closely together, and this was one she knew well. A message never sent lightly, a name never written, without intent. And as the house settled into quiet around her, Miss Marple understood that the envelope was not the beginning, but a reminder. Something unfinished had been set in motion once more, and before long, the village would remember why some names were best left unaddressed. Chapter 2. By the time the church bells finished their midday practice, the story had already changed shape twice, which was how Miss Marple knew it had struck a nerve. In the village, truly harmless things stayed simple. They remained exactly what they were when first spoken. Only the matters that unsettled people began to gather extra details, like burrs on a skirt hem, until no one remembered where they had started. Miss Marple walked toward the lane that led to the vicarage, her steps unhurried, her expression mild, as though her errand were no more significant than returning a borrowed recipe. The winter air held that clean, faintly metallic scent that came before rain. Somewhere behind a hedge, a child laughed, and the sound ended abruptly, as if someone had gently reminded them to be quiet. At the corner by the bakery, Mrs. Pike leaned toward Mrs. Ellis and spoke in a voice meant to sound casual. Miss Marple did not need to strain to catch it. Village voices, even softened, carried. "I tell you, he looked right at it as though it had grown teeth," Mrs. Pike said. And then, seeing Miss Marple, added more loudly, "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. You do keep your garden so tidy." Miss Marple smiled and inclined her head. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Pike. A tidy garden is only a habit, you know. It does not mean one is not distracted." Mrs. Ellis gave a small, nervous laugh that did not match her eyes. "Oh, we are all distracted today." "Mrs. Linton's post, you mean?" "It appears the post has become quite the subject," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Pike gave the eager look of someone relieved to speak to a person who would listen. "It is not only Mrs. Linton. There are rumors now." "Rumors are like steam," Miss Marple replied. "They rise from the smallest pot." Mrs. Pike leaned closer anyway, lowering her voice again. "They say Mrs. Wainwright was terribly upset this morning. The vicar's wife, you know. Someone told her something before the service practice, and she has been dropping things ever since." Miss Marple made a small sound of interest. No more than one might make it a change in the weather. Dropping things can be very informative, when it is not simply clumsiness. Mrs. Ellis glanced toward the churchyard and then away. She was seen by the vestry door, holding her key ring like it was heavy, and she looked as though she had not slept. Miss Marple thanked them pleasantly and continued on her way, carrying the gossip as neatly as if it were a parcel. She did not hurry. When people were anxious, they often expected one to hurry, and the refusal to do so had a curious effect. It made them reveal more, trying to fill the silence. The vicarage sat behind a low stone wall and a line of bare-limbed shrubs that would be charming again in spring. The gate latch squeaked faintly when Miss Marple opened it, a small domestic sound that usually suggested comfort. Today it sounded like a warning whispered politely. Mrs. Wainwright opened the door herself, which was unusual. She usually allowed the maid to do it, even when she was expecting a visitor, as though the act of greeting people belonged to her role rather than her person. Today her cheeks were a little too pink, her hair smoothed too firmly back from her face, and there was a faint dusting of flour on one sleeve as if she had begun a task and forgotten why. "Miss Marple," she said quickly. "How nice." Her voice trailed off. Not because she lacked words, but because her thoughts had slipped somewhere else. Miss Marple noted, with quiet precision, that Mrs. Wainwright's gaze flickered toward the hall table, where a small stack of letters lay beside a heavy brass paperweight. "I was walking this way," Miss Marple said, stepping inside, "and I thought I might return your book. The one about household remedies. I found the section on lavender water quite useful." Mrs. Wainwright's hands moved to take the book, then paused, as though she had forgotten how to hold something properly. "Oh, yes. Lavender. How sensible." The sitting room was warm and neat, arranged with the careful taste of a woman who considered her home part of her public duty. Yet Miss Marple noticed a chair slightly out of place, angled toward the writing desk. It looked as though someone had sat there in a hurry, not to be comfortable, but to be close enough to reach a drawer without standing. Tea appeared quickly. Mrs. Wainwright poured with an almost exaggerated steadiness, though her fingers trembled all the same. Miss Marple watched the teapot's lid rattle faintly, and saw Mrs. Wainwright tighten her grip on the handle as if strength could silence it. "I am sure you have heard," Mrs. Wainwright said at once, forcing a smile. "About the envelope." "The village has ears," Miss Marple replied, "even when it pretends not to listen." Mrs. Wainwright let out a small breath. Half relief, half dread. "It is so foolish. So unkind. People have no respect now for what should remain private." Miss Marple took her tea and tasted it. The sugar had not been stirred properly. A small thing, but telling. Mrs. Wainwright prided herself on hospitality. Unstirred sugar suggested she had been thinking of something else, while her hands performed the motions of politeness. "It is the name, of course," Mrs. Wainwright continued. "Too quickly. That is what makes it feel unsettling. If it had been addressed to anyone else, it would be nothing. But that name has been gone for so long. And yet it has not been forgotten," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Wainwright's smile tightened and then softened again in a way that might have seemed natural to anyone not watching closely. "We do not forget. No. But we do not speak of it either. That is better." Miss Marple allowed a pause. She watched Mrs. Wainwright's eyes go again to the hall table and the letters. It was not merely curiosity. It was apprehension. "I am sorry, Mrs." Wainwright said suddenly, setting down her cup with a faint clink that was just a touch too loud. "You must think me dreadfully silly. It is just that I have had a strange morning." Miss Marple's tone remained kind. Strange mornings do not make a person silly. They only reveal what a person has been carrying. Mrs. Wainwright gave a small laugh that sounded like someone trying to prove she could. Carrying. Yes, that is a good word. Miss Marple looked toward the writing desk, not as though she suspected anything, but as though she appreciated the craftsmanship. "You have a very fine desk. It must hold many things." Mrs. Wainwright's hand moved instinctively toward her skirt pocket, where a key might be kept. "Oh, it is just a desk. Nothing of importance." "Desks have their own importance," Miss Marple said. "They are where people sit when they wish to put their thoughts in order." Mrs. Wainwright's cheeks flushed again. "Well, yes. The vicar writes his notes there, of course. Miss Marple took another sip of tea and made a small, appreciative sound. And do you write as well, Mrs. Wainwright? The question was asked in the mildest way. Yet Mrs. Wainwright's eyes widened a fraction, and her answer came just a beat too late. Only lists, she said. Shopping lists. Lists of parish needs. Nothing personal. Miss Marple nodded. Lists can be very personal. In their own way. They show what one fears running out of. Mrs. Wainwright's mouth opened and closed again, as though she had been about to speak and thought better of it. A soft knock sounded at the back door. The maid's voice murmured. Mrs. Wainwright rose quickly, too quickly, and then forced herself to slow down, smoothing her skirt with deliberate care. Miss Marple watched the performance with gentle understanding. It was the sort of control people attempted when control was already slipping. When Mrs. Wainwright returned, she carried a plate of biscuits, though it was clear she had forgotten the purpose of fetching them. She set them down and then stood for a moment, looking at them as though she did not remember putting them there. "Forgive me," she said. "My head is elsewhere today." "It has been elsewhere since before I came," Miss Marple replied, her tone still warm. It is often easier to speak when someone sits quietly and lets you. Mrs. Wainwright's eyes filled slightly, and then she blinked it away, tightening her smile once more. "It is nothing I should trouble you with." Miss Marple's expression was gentle, almost amused. "My dear, village troubles are like crumbs. They find their way into every corner. One may as well acknowledge them." Mrs. Wainwright lowered herself back into her chair. Her hands clasped so tightly Miss Marple could see the faint whiteness of knuckles beneath the skin. "This morning," Mrs. Wainwright began, and then stopped. She glanced toward the window, as if expecting someone to be listening outside. Miss Marple did not encourage her with words. She merely waited, sipping her tea, letting the silence do what it always did in small rooms. It pressed lightly. Not harshly, but enough to make a person feel it. "This morning," Mrs. Wainwright continued, "someone came before the bells, before anyone else was about." Miss Marple's voice remained mild. "To the vicarage," Mrs. Wainwright shook her head quickly. "No, not here. To the churchyard." "To the post box near the lich gate," Miss Marple set down her cup, her movements calm. "I see. I did not go to them," Mrs. Wainwright said, as though defending herself. "I only saw them from the vestry window. I was arranging the altar cloth. I always do it early on Thursdays." "Habits are very useful," Miss Marple said. "They place us where we can see what others do not expect us to see." Mrs. Wainwright swallowed. It was a figure. Just a figure in a coat. They stood by the post box for a long time. They did not post anything. They only waited. Miss Marple's eyes softened, thoughtful. Waiting suggests uncertainty. Or decision. Mrs. Wainwright nodded rapidly, grateful for the words. "Yes. That is it." As if they were deciding whether to put something in or take something out. Miss Marple's tone stayed gentle. "And did they take something out?" Mrs. Wainwright hesitated. Her gaze flickered toward the hall table again. "I could not see clearly. The window glass was misted. But I saw their hand go toward the opening. I saw them lean in. Afterward, Miss Marple asked softly, 'Did you go to the post box?' Mrs. Wainwright's cheeks flushed. "No. I could not. It felt wrong. It felt as though I would be stepping into something I did not understand." Miss Marple nodded, as though this were perfectly sensible. "When people sense trouble, they often step back first. It is natural." Mrs. Wainwright's eyes darted to Miss Marple's face. "Trouble. You think it is trouble?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I think it is intention. And intention is rarely harmless when it hides." Mrs. Wainwright exhaled shakily. "Then there was another thing." Miss Marple waited. "A letter," Mrs. Wainwright said in a whisper. "Not the one Mrs. Linton received. Another. I heard of it, not officially. Only a remark made too quickly by someone who did not realize I was close enough to hear. Miss Marple's voice was quiet and calm. Who made the remark? Mrs. Wainwright's mouth tightened. Mrs. Carter. She was speaking to the florist girl. She said, if one letter can appear, why not two? And then she stopped speaking as though she had bitten her own tongue. Miss Marple's gaze remained attentive. Mrs. Carter does not often bite her tongue. No, Mrs. Wainwright agreed, and there was a faint bitterness in her tone that surprised her. She softened it quickly. She is very devoted. To the church, I mean. But she does enjoy knowing things before others. Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with gentle understanding. Devotion and curiosity often share a pew. Mrs. Wainwright gave a small, reluctant smile that faded as quickly as it came. There is something else. About the envelope itself, Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, still relaxed. Yes. Mrs. Wainwright looked down at her hands. I should not say it. It is uncharitable. Miss Marple's voice remained kind. Truth is not uncharitable. The manner in which it is used can be... Mrs. Wainwright swallowed. The paper. Mrs. Linton showed it to me for a moment when she came earlier. She wanted my opinion. The paper felt not new. Not exactly. It had that faint smell of a drawer, of dried flowers. Like something kept away, Miss Marple's attention sharpened invisibly. Lavender. Mrs. Wainwright looked up quickly. Yes. Exactly. Lavender. How did you? Miss Marple smiled softly. Lavender is common in drawers where people keep old linens, old letters, old promises. It is a domestic habit. One does not notice it until it matters. Mrs. Wainwright's lips parted, and Miss Marple saw the moment she realized she had said more than she intended. I am being ridiculous, Mrs. Wainwright whispered. No, Miss Marple said gently. You are being observant. That is not ridiculous. It is rare. Mrs. Wainwright's eyes filled again, and she blinked hard. It is simply that the name on that envelope. It belongs to someone who caused such unease. And now the village is stirring like a pot left too long on the stove. Miss Marple's voice was warm, as though confiding over tea. When a village stirs, it is usually because someone has reached the bottom with a spoon. Mrs. Wainwright gave a faint, shaky laugh. And who do you think is holding the spoon? Miss Marple did not answer directly. She looked instead toward the hall table once more, where the stack of letters lay under the brass paperweight. Something about their neatness seemed too deliberate, as though someone had arranged them after disturbing them. May I, Miss Marple said lightly, ask a very ordinary question? Mrs. Wainwright nodded, eager for anything ordinary. Has anyone been using your writing desk besides the vicar? Miss Marple asked, as if she were asking about sugar. Mrs. Wainwright stiffened. No. Of course not. Miss Marple's tone remained mild. Not even to borrow a pen. Mrs. Wainwright hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward the desk, and then away. Well, the choir mistress came yesterday. She needed to write a note, but she sat at the kitchen table, I believe. Miss Marple's voice stayed calm. Believe. Mrs. Wainwright's cheeks flushed. I was not watching her every moment, Miss Marple. Of course not. Miss Marple said gently. One does not watch friends, only strangers. Mrs. Wainwright's hands twisted together. Why are you asking? Miss Marple smiled kindly. Because the smallest details often matter most. A desk drawer opened. A sheet of paper taken. A stamp borrowed. These are not dramatic things, yet they are the ways people leave traces of their intentions. Mrs. Wainwright stared at her, breathing shallowly. For a moment, the careful composure slipped, revealing something raw beneath it. I found the drawer slightly ajar this morning, she admitted in a whisper. Only a little, as if it had not been pushed in properly. Miss Marple's eyes remained soft. And did you mention it to anyone? Mrs. Wainwright shook her head quickly. No. It seemed foolish. It is only a drawer. Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but there was a firmness underneath, like a steady hand on a railing. It is never only a drawer, my dear. Not when the village is receiving letters that should not exist. A sound came from the hall. A faint scrape, as though something had shifted against wood. Mrs. Wainwright froze. Her gaze flicked toward the doorway, her mouth slightly open. Miss Marple rose smoothly, not hurried, and moved toward the hall with the calm authority of someone who belonged in every room she entered. The stack of letters on the table looked untouched, yet the brass paperweight sat at a different angle than before. Only a fraction. Only enough for a careful eye to notice. Mrs. Wainwright followed, her steps hesitant. It must be the maid, she whispered, though her voice did not believe it. Miss Marple's hand hovered above the top envelope. She did not open it. She did not need to. She simply noticed the corner, where the paper had been pressed slightly, as though someone had handled it and replaced it quickly. From the back of the house, a door clicked shut, softly, politely, like someone leaving without wishing to be seen. Mrs. Wainwright's face went pale. Someone was here, she breathed. Miss Marple turned her head slightly, listening. The house had settled into a stillness that felt arranged, not natural. She looked at Mrs. Wainwright with the gentlest expression, as if offering comfort, though her eyes held quiet certainty. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "I think someone has been here more than once." And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow move inside a house that pretended to be safe. Chapter 3. The remark reached Miss Marple over the rim of a teacup, delivered with the lightness of someone pretending it meant nothing at all. Mrs. Parker, seated near the window of the Three Hares Inn, leaned toward her companion and said that it was curious how some cups cooled faster than others, even when poured from the same pot. She laughed as she said it, but her eyes flicked toward the corner table, where one cup sat untouched, its surface perfectly still. Miss Marple, who had just arrived and had not yet removed her gloves, noticed the same thing at once. The Three Hares was the sort of place where people gathered not because they were hungry, but because they wished to be seen without appearing to seek company. It smelled faintly of polished wood and stewed fruit, comforting scents that encouraged people to speak freely. Miss Marple took her usual seat, close enough to hear without seeming to listen, and accepted a cup of tea from the innkeeper's sister, Miss Eliza Grant. Miss Grant's smile was bright, but it lingered just a fraction too long, as though she were waiting for something else to be said. She placed the cup down carefully, aligning it with the saucer in a way that suggested effort rather than habit. "Quiet morning," Miss Marple observed pleasantly. "Oh yes," Miss Grant replied at once. "Quiet as can be. Though, of course, quiet never lasts long in a village, does it?" Miss Marple smiled. "No, quiet is usually just a pause between remarks." Miss Grant laughed, a sound that rose a little too high and fell too quickly. "Well, if you hear anything interesting, do let me know. One likes to be prepared." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, watching the surface. Prepared was an interesting choice of word. She took a sip and noticed at once that the tea was slightly stronger than usual. Miss Grant prided herself on consistency. A stronger brew suggested distraction, or perhaps an attempt to fortify herself. At the corner table, the untouched cup remained. Miss Marple let her gaze drift toward it, as though idly appreciating the light through the window. The cup belonged to Mr. Harold Finch, a traveling clerk who had arrived in the village only 2 days earlier. He sat nearby, leaning back in his chair, speaking animatedly to Mrs. Parker about the difficulties of finding decent lodging in small places. His hands moved often as he spoke, expressive and confident, yet he never reached for his tea. Miss Marple watched this with quiet interest. People who talked with their hands usually did so without thinking. To avoid touching something required a different sort of awareness. Mrs. Parker's voice dropped again. I heard it myself, she said. At the counter. When he thought no one was listening. Miss Marple did not look at her. The clerk, Mrs. Parker said, nodding slightly. He was asking about returned post. Letters that had not reached their destination. Miss Marple's spoon paused, then resumed its gentle circle. That is an unusual question for someone staying so briefly. Yes, Mrs. Parker agreed, her tone eager. That is what I thought. And he said something else. He said he had handled a letter not long ago that felt familiar. Miss Marple lifted her eyes then, meeting Mrs. Parker's gaze with mild curiosity. Familiar. Mrs. Parker nodded. Same phrasing, he said. Same sort of sentence, as though someone had written it twice. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her attention sharpened. Repetition suggested intention. She glanced again at Mr. Finch's untouched cup. The tea would be cold by now. As if sensing her gaze, Mr. Finch turned and smiled, a wide, friendly expression that did not quite reach his eyes. He lifted his cup at last, took a cautious sip, and then set it down again, untouched afterward. Miss Marple finished her tea and rose, gathering her gloves. She passed the corner table on her way out and paused briefly, as though adjusting her coat. Excuse me, she said kindly to Mr. Finch. I could not help noticing. Your tea has gone quite cold. Mr. Finch laughed easily. Oh, I have a terrible habit of forgetting such things when I am talking. It is a flaw, I am afraid. A common one, Miss Marple agreed, though some forgetfulness is more deliberate than others. His smile wavered, just a fraction. I beg your pardon. Miss Marple smiled in return, warm and harmless. Oh, nothing at all. I was thinking aloud. Enjoy your stay. She left the inn with the feeling of having brushed against something smooth on the surface and sharp beneath. Outside, the air had cooled, and the village street was busier than it had been earlier. News traveled quickly now. Miss Marple passed Mrs. Green and Mrs. Ellis whispering near the butcher's shop, their heads bent together like conspirators. When they saw her, they straightened and greeted her with exaggerated cheer. Such a lovely day, Mrs. Ellis said. Perfect for errands, Mrs. Green added. Perfect for conversation, Miss Marple replied gently. They exchanged a look, then Mrs. Green leaned closer, unable to resist. You have heard, of course, about the inn. Miss Marple tilted her head. The inn hears many things. They say someone found a scrap of paper there, Mrs. Ellis said, lowering her voice. Behind the mantel clock. Folded very small, Miss Marple's interest deepened. And what sort of scrap was it? Oh, nothing important, Mrs. Green said too quickly. Just a note. But the writing looked the same, they say. Same neat hand. Who says? Miss Marple asked mildly. Mrs. Ellis flushed. Miss Grant mentioned it. She said she almost threw it away, but then thought better of it. Miss Marple nodded. That was wise of her. The women leaned closer. It had been tucked behind the clock for some time, Mrs. Green continued. Long enough to gather dust. Which is strange, because Miss Grant cleans thoroughly. Unless she had a reason not to disturb it, Miss Marple said softly. The women straightened again, suddenly conscious of how much they had said. Well, Mrs. Ellis said brightly, it is probably nothing. People leave notes everywhere. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, especially when they wish them to be found later. She continued on her way, her thoughts arranging themselves neatly. A letter repeated, a scrap hidden. A clerk asking questions. It suggested practice. Rehearsal. Someone ensuring that a message could be recognized. She arrived home to find a visitor waiting. Mrs. Carter sat in the front room, her hat still on her head, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. She rose at once when Miss Marple entered, her smile fixed and eager. I hope I am not intruding, Mrs. Carter said. I was passing and thought I might stop by. Miss Marple gestured her to sit. You are always welcome. Mrs. Carter perched on the edge of the chair, as though ready to leave at a moment's notice. I heard you were at the inn. Yes, Miss Marple replied. I took tea. Mrs. Carter laughed. One hears so much over tea, does one not? One does, Miss Marple agreed, sometimes more than people intend. Mrs. Carter's eyes flickered. And did you hear anything interesting? Miss Marple met her gaze calmly. I heard that someone has been handling letters that were not meant to be handled. Mrs. Carter's smile tightened. Oh, that. Well, in these times one cannot be too careful. The post is not what it used to be. Nor are people, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Carter shifted in her seat. I only meant that misunderstandings happen. Papers get mixed, notes misplaced. Notes hidden, Miss Marple added. Mrs. Carter's laugh sounded brittle. Hidden. Yes, people do hide things. Miss Marple poured tea, noticing that Mrs. Carter did not reach for sugar. She watched the woman's hands instead, the way one finger rubbed at the glove seam, worrying it. You enjoy knowing what happens in the village, Miss Marple said conversationally. Mrs. Carter preened slightly. I like to be informed. It is part of being a good neighbor. And yet, Miss Marple continued softly. Some information weighs heavier than others. Mrs. Carter's voice dropped. That letter. It should never have appeared. Miss Marple looked at her steadily. Why not? Mrs. Carter hesitated. Because it belongs to the past. The past, Miss Marple said, has a habit of returning when it is invited. Mrs. Carter's eyes widened. Invited, yes, Miss Marple said gently. Letters do not write themselves. There was a pause, thick and uncomfortable. Mrs. Carter cleared her throat. I must be going. I only wished to see how you were. Miss Marple smiled. I am quite well. Thank you for asking. Mrs. Carter rose quickly and left. Her steps hurried, her farewell abrupt. Miss Marple remained seated, listening to the sound of her retreating. That evening, as dusk settled, Miss Marple walked past the inn once more. Through the window, she saw Miss Grant standing alone by the mantel clock, holding something small in her hand. When she noticed Miss Marple outside, she jumped slightly and tucked the object into her pocket. Miss Marple did not stop. She did not need to. She had seen enough. At home, she lit the lamp and sat quietly, reviewing the day. The untouched tea, the hidden scrap, the repeated phrasing, the clerk's careful forgetfulness, Mrs. Carter's eagerness to dismiss what she knew too well. Someone was constructing a trail, piece by piece, using ordinary places and ordinary habits. Someone who understood that, in a village, the smallest domestic detail could speak the loudest. As Miss Marple prepared for bed, she thought again of the scrap behind the clock, left where it would be found, but not too quickly. A message waiting for the right moment. And as the house grew quiet, Miss Marple felt a familiar certainty settle over her. Calm, but unmistakable. The letters were not warnings. They were rehearsals. And whoever was writing them had not yet finished speaking. Chapter 4. The first hint reached Miss Marple in the most ordinary way possible, carried by a sound that did not belong where it was. In the village shop, where the ticking clock and the soft rustle of paper bags usually ruled the air, there came a sharp, impatient tear. It was the sound of paper being ripped quickly, not accidentally. Miss Marple, standing patiently near the shelves of preserves, lifted her eyes at once. The village shop was a place of habits. People queued in predictable order, spoke in familiar rhythms, and paid with coins counted carefully into waiting palms. Miss Marple had always believed that if one wished to understand a village, one needed only to stand quietly in its shop, and observe who lingered, who rushed, and who avoided looking at certain corners. Mrs. Hobson, the shopkeeper, stood behind the counter with her back very straight and her mouth set in a determined smile. She was a woman who valued order deeply. Her ledger lay open beside the till, her pencil aligned neatly along its spine. Yet beneath the blotter, just visible if one happened to look, a small scrap of paper protruded at an odd angle. Miss Marple noticed it at once. She waited her turn without hurry, listening as Mrs. Green complained about the price of flour and Mrs. Ellis murmured agreement. Their voices carried an undercurrent of excitement, the sort that came when a village sensed something unfolding. "It's the letters," Mrs. Green said, not quite whispering. "People are saying there's more than one now." Mrs. Hobson's pencil snapped. "I don't see what letters have to do with bread," she said briskly. Miss Marple smiled to herself. When people snapped at harmless remarks, it was rarely the remark itself that bothered them. When her turn came, Miss Marple asked for a small jar of marmalade she did not particularly need. Mrs. Hobson reached for it quickly, too quickly, knocking the blotter aside in the process. The scrap of paper slid further into view. It was a receipt. Miss Marple's eyes rested on it without appearing to. Receipts were commonplace things. Yet this one had been folded and unfolded several times, its edges soft with handling. A date was visible, written clearly at the top. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her mind did. The date was unmistakable. It was the day of the funeral, the day Mrs. Hobson had sworn the shop was closed out of respect. Mrs. Hobson followed Miss Marple's gaze and reacted at once. Her hand shot forward, snatching the receipt and tearing it cleanly in half. "There," she said sharply. "Rubbish. Old things piling up." The sound of tearing paper echoed in the small room. Miss Marple accepted her marmalade and her change with gentle politeness. "It is easy for things to pile up," she said mildly. "Particularly when one is busy." Mrs. Hobson's smile returned, fixed and brittle. "Busy is no excuse for untidiness." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It is often the cause of it." She stepped aside, allowing the next customer forward, and lingered near the shelves as though considering another purchase. In truth, she was considering the torn edge of the receipt, which Mrs. Hobson had failed to hide completely. One half remained tucked beneath the blotter, its jagged edge visible. Jagged, Miss Marple noted, not straight. Torn in haste. Mrs. Carter entered the shop then, her arrival accompanied by a flutter of skirts and curiosity. She greeted everyone at once, her voice bright, her eyes darting. "Well," she said, "it seems the village has quite a mystery on its hands." Mrs. Hobson stiffened. "If you're here for gossip, you'll find none sold here," Mrs. Carter laughed. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of buying it. It's being given away freely." Miss Marple selected a tin of biscuits she did not need either, and brought it to the counter, extending her stay. She noticed how Mrs. Hobson's hands shook slightly as she wrapped it. Mrs. Carter leaned closer to Miss Marple. "They say something was delivered privately," she murmured. "Not through the usual channels." Miss Marple raised her brows faintly. "Delivered where?" Mrs. Carter smiled, enjoying herself. "A back gate. Late afternoon. Paid in coins." Mrs. Hobson dropped the string she was tying. "People say anything," she said sharply. "Coins are perfectly respectable." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "They make very little record." Mrs. Hobson shot her a look, then bent to retrieve the string. Her cheeks were flushed now, the composure slipping. Miss Marple left the shop soon after, her parcels light but her thoughts heavy. Outside, she paused near the window, just long enough to see Mrs. Hobson retrieve the torn receipt and slip it into her apron pocket with unnecessary force. The afternoon carried on, the way afternoons always did. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the post office, exchanging greetings, collecting fragments. Mrs. Ellis, standing near the notice board, leaned in confidentially. "You were in the shop?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Did you see it?" "I saw many things." Miss Marple replied pleasantly. Mrs. Ellis lowered her voice. That receipt. Mrs. Hobson swore the shop was shut that day, but my cousin passed through the lane and said he saw the back door open. Miss Marple nodded. Back doors are very revealing. They say the delivery was wrapped in brown paper. Mrs. Ellis continued eagerly. Small enough to carry under a coat. And paid for quietly, Miss Marple added. Mrs. Ellis's eyes widened. You have heard? Miss Marple smiled. The village speaks. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Linton, under the perfectly reasonable excuse of returning a teacup borrowed weeks earlier. Mrs. Linton received her with nervous warmth, ushering her into the parlor where the envelope had first appeared. Tea was poured, though Mrs. Linton's hand shook as she lifted the pot. I wish this would all settle, she said with forced cheer. It is exhausting. Miss Marple glanced at the sideboard, where a small stack of papers lay neatly arranged. Among them, she noticed a folded slip with a familiar color. Receipts can be tiresome, Miss Marple remarked lightly. Mrs. Linton froze. Receipts, yes, Miss Marple said. One forgets how many small records pass through a household. Mrs. Linton's smile tightened. I throw most of them away. Do you? Miss Marple said. Or do you keep the important ones? Mrs. Linton's fingers curled slightly against the arm of her chair. What are you suggesting? Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly. Only that people often keep what they believe might be needed again. Mrs. Linton swallowed. That letter. You think it was bought? Miss Marple did not answer directly. Paper has to come from somewhere. Mrs. Linton looked down at her lap. I thought it felt old. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Old paper has a memory. It folds differently. It carries scent. Mrs. Linton looked up sharply. Lavender. Miss Marple nodded. Silence settled between them, thick but not unfriendly. Outside, footsteps passed along the lane, voices rising and falling. There is something else, Mrs. Linton said suddenly. About the receipt day. Miss Marple waited. I was at the funeral, Mrs. Linton continued. Everyone was. But I left early. I felt unwell. Miss Marple's gaze remained kind. And you saw the shop. Mrs. Linton hesitated. The front was closed. But the back, I did not think much of it. Few people do, Miss Marple said. Until they must, Mrs. Linton's eyes filled briefly. You think someone planned this? Carefully? Yes, Miss Marple replied. Careful planning leaves traces. Carelessness hides behind noise. As Miss Marple walked home in the fading light, she turned the day over in her mind. The torn receipt, the back door, the coins, the lavender-scented paper. These were not accidents. They were choices. At her gate, she found Mrs. Hobson waiting. I hope you don't mind, Mrs. Hobson said stiffly. I thought I should explain. Explanations are always interesting, Miss Marple said warmly. Mrs. Hobson's voice was tight. The receipt means nothing. I did open the shop that day. Only briefly. Someone needed something urgently. What sort of thing? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Hobson's eyes flickered. Stationery. Miss Marple nodded. Paper. And an envelope, Mrs. Hobson added quickly. And perhaps a stamp, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Hobson's face drained of color. I did not know what it would be used for. Did you ask? Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Hobson shook her head. They paid and left. In coins. I thought it best not to pry. Miss Marple's expression remained kind, but her words carried weight. When people avoid prying, it is often because they fear what they might see. Mrs. Hobson's shoulders sagged. I did not think it would come to this. Miss Marple touched her arm lightly. It rarely does, at first. Mrs. Hobson left soon after, her steps heavy. Miss Marple stood alone in her garden, the evening air cool against her face. She looked toward the village lights, each window glowing with ordinary life. Someone had purchased the means to write a letter that should not exist. Someone had chosen an old paper, an old scent, an old memory. Someone had ensured the trail would begin quietly, domestically, respectably. As she went inside, Miss Marple felt the calm certainty grow stronger. The receipt was not merely proof of a purchase. It was proof of preparation. And as she set her teacup down and listened to the house settle, Miss Marple knew that the careful tearing of paper in the village shop had been the sound of someone trying and failing to erase a decision already made. Chapter 5. The comment drifted to Miss Marple from behind a shelf of books, spoken in a tone meant to sound lightly amused. The librarian remarked that people had become careless with bookmarks lately, leaving all sorts of things behind as though paper were no longer worth keeping. She smiled as she said it, but there was a faint tightness in her voice that did not belong to amusement at all. Miss Marple paused just inside the village library and listened, because careless remarks were rarely careless in the places where quiet mattered most. The library was one of Miss Marple's favorite rooms in the village. It was orderly without being severe, warm without being indulgent, and filled with the comforting illusion that knowledge could be neatly shelved. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, settling on the long tables where readers sat with the careful posture of people who wished to be seen as respectable. Miss Marple moved slowly along the shelves, her fingers brushing the spines as though in greeting. Mrs. Alderton, the librarian, stood behind her desk, arranging returned books with unnecessary precision. She was a woman devoted to rules, fond of reminding people that even borrowed things had their proper place. Today, however, she aligned the volumes twice before seeming satisfied, and even then she glanced back at them as though expecting them to move. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Mrs. Alderton looked up too quickly. "Oh, Miss Marple, I did not hear you come in." "It is a quiet place," Miss Marple replied. "Sounds behave themselves here." Mrs. Alderton gave a small laugh that did not linger. "One hopes so." Miss Marple selected a slim volume of local history and carried it to a nearby table. She did not open it at once. Instead, she observed. A young woman sat near the window reading with exaggerated concentration, her eyes flicking up each time someone passed. An older gentleman pretended to nap with a book across his chest, though his ears were clearly engaged elsewhere. The library was listening. Mrs. Alderton cleared her throat. "I must ask people to be more careful," she said, speaking a little too loudly. "Someone returned a book this morning with items inside." Miss Marple lifted her eyes. "Items. Bookmarks," Mrs. Alderton said quickly. "Two of them." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Two. Yes," Mrs. Alderton continued, her hands busy with nothing at all. "One perfectly proper, the sort one expects. Ribbon. Quite respectable. And the other," Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Alderton hesitated. The hesitation was brief, but it was there. The other was not a bookmark at all, just a scrap of paper. Miss Marple smiled mildly. Scraps often wander into books. They enjoy the company. Mrs. Alderton did not smile back. This one had writing on it. The older gentleman shifted in his chair. The young woman by the window stopped turning pages altogether. "What sort of writing?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Alderton lowered her voice despite herself. "A sentence. Only one." Miss Marple felt a familiar settling in her thoughts. And was it an ordinary sentence? Mrs. Alderton's mouth tightened. "No." Miss Marple opened her book at last. More for appearance than need. Ordinary sentences rarely cause concern. Mrs. Alderton leaned forward slightly. It referred to a promise. And a time. And a place that, well, that ought not to be mentioned. Miss Marple turned a page calmly. "Libraries remember many things people wish to forget." Mrs. Alderton glanced around, then leaned closer. It was placed very deliberately, between pages, as though someone wished it to be found, but not too quickly. Miss Marple nodded almost imperceptibly. "Patience suggests confidence." Mrs. Alderton's eyes widened. "You think it was intentional?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that accidents rarely fold themselves so neatly." Mrs. Alderton swallowed. "I removed it at once, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. and I put it somewhere safe. Miss Marple's gaze lifted, warm and attentive. Safe places are interesting. They often reveal what we fear. Mrs. Alderton flushed. I did not want to alarm anyone. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, "You mentioned it just now." Mrs. Alderton pressed her lips together. People talk anyway. It seemed better they hear it from me. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Better from a librarian than a gossip. Mrs. Alderton hesitated, then nodded. I suppose so. Miss Marple closed her book gently. May I ask which book it was? Mrs. Alderton's answer came too quickly. A romance novel. Popular. Borrowed often. Miss Marple's brows lifted faintly. Then it would pass through many hands. Yes, Mrs. Alderton said, which is why it is impossible to know who placed it there. Impossible, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Mrs. Alderton shifted her weight. I checked the borrowing card. Out of habit, Miss Marple's eyes met hers. And it had been returned yesterday, Mrs. Alderton said. By Mrs. Carter, the name settled into the room like a dropped plate. The older gentleman coughed. The young woman by the window bent over her book again, her ears reddening. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Mrs. Carter is fond of novels. Yes, Mrs. Alderton agreed. She says they relax her. Miss Marple smiled gently. Some people relax by reading, others by knowing. Mrs. Alderton hesitated. The scrap was torn from a letter. Miss Marple felt the pieces align. You could tell. The edge, Mrs. Alderton said. Uneven. As if it had been ripped in a hurry. And the paper, it smelled faintly of lavender. Miss Marple nodded. A popular scent for drawers. Mrs. Alderton's voice dropped. The sentence mentioned the choir loft. Miss Marple's fingers stilled on the page. That is a very specific place, yes, Mrs. Alderton said. And not one mentioned lightly. Miss Marple closed the book and rose. May I see the scrap? Mrs. Alderton looked torn. I should not. You may, Miss Marple said gently, and you will feel better afterward. After a moment, Mrs. Alderton opened a small drawer beneath her desk and removed a folded piece of paper. She handed it over with the air of someone relinquishing a burden. Miss Marple read the sentence carefully. It was written in the same neat hand she had seen before. Confident, deliberate, practiced. The wording echoed the letter addressed to the forgotten name. Not exactly, but close enough to be unmistakable. It reads like a reminder, Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Alderton nodded. That is what unsettled me. Reminders, Miss Marple continued, are written for two reasons. Either the writer fears forgetting, or they wish to ensure someone else remembers. Mrs. Alderton looked stricken. You think it was meant for a particular reader? Yes, Miss Marple replied. And placed where that reader would find it without suspicion. Mrs. Alderton whispered, Mrs. Carter. Miss Marple did not contradict her. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, Mrs. Alderton said hurriedly, There is something else. Miss Marple paused. The borrowing card, Mrs. Alderton said. Mrs. Carter was not the only one. Miss Marple waited. Before her, Mrs. Alderton continued. The book was borrowed by Mr. Finch. The traveling clerk, Miss Marple felt the pattern tighten. And before him, Mrs. Alderton's voice dropped. Miss Grant. From the inn, Miss Marple nodded. A chain, yes, Mrs. Alderton said faintly. A chain of ordinary people. Ordinary, Miss Marple agreed. Which makes it effective. Outside, the afternoon had softened. Miss Marple walked slowly toward home, passing the churchyard where the choir loft rose above the door like an attentive ear. She imagined the scrap tucked inside the book, waiting, patient and confident. At the corner, she encountered Mrs. Carter herself, who greeted her with enthusiastic warmth. Such a busy day, Mrs. Carter said. The library, the shop, the inn. One can hardly keep track. Miss Marple smiled. Books have a way of connecting places. Mrs. Carter laughed a little too loudly. Do they? They remember who touches them, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Carter's laughter faded. I do hope you are not suggesting. I am suggesting nothing, Miss Marple replied kindly. I am only observing. Mrs. Carter's eyes darted toward the church, then back. Some things are better left where they belong. Yes, Miss Marple said, provided no one has already moved them. Mrs. Carter excused herself abruptly and hurried away. Miss Marple continued on, her thoughts calm, her conclusions forming without hurry. A note hidden in a book. A sentence rehearsed. A place named too deliberately. Someone was reminding. Someone was guiding. As evening settled, Miss Marple stood by her window, watching the church bell rope sway gently in the dim light. The scrap of paper had not been a threat. It had been an instruction, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that whoever was arranging these quiet messages had chosen the library for a reason. Books waited patiently. And so, it seemed, did the truth. Chapter 6. The first hint arrived on the afternoon breeze, carried by a voice lowered too carefully to be natural. Miss Marple heard it as she approached the rose garden, a polite murmur that stopped the moment footsteps were sensed. The pause itself was revealing. In the village, conversations did not stop unless there was something to hide. The rose garden lay between the church wall and the narrow path leading toward the older cottages. In summer, it was admired for its color and scent. In winter, it revealed more honest truths. The bushes were cut back now, their stems bare and exposed, showing exactly where they had been trained to grow. Miss Marple often thought people were much the same when stripped of comfort. She walked slowly along the path, her expression mild, her attention sharp. Near the iron gate, two figures stood closer together than courtesy required. Mr. Phelps and Mrs. Grant did not look at one another when Miss Marple approached, which was in itself quite telling. Instead, they focused intently on the rose stems as though discussing pruning techniques. Good afternoon, Miss Marple said pleasantly. They both started, not violently, but enough to suggest surprise rather than coincidence. Miss Marple, Mrs. Grant said quickly. Such a brisk day. Yes, Miss Marple replied. The air makes people speak plainly. Or not at all. Mr. Phelps cleared his throat. We were just discussing the state of the roses. Mrs. Grant nodded at once. They suffered this year. They have, Miss Marple agreed, glancing at the ground near the gate. Though they appear to have been disturbed recently. Mrs. Grant's eyes flicked downward and then away. The groundskeeper came through yesterday. Did he? Miss Marple said softly. That is interesting. Mr. Phelps shifted his weight. Is it? Yes, Miss Marple replied. Because the ground was raked smooth this morning, both of them fell silent. Miss Marple did not press them. She never did. She had learned that people revealed far more when they believed they were not being examined. She smiled kindly and continued past them, feeling rather than seeing their eyes follow her. Beyond the gate, she paused as though admiring the winter light. In truth, she was studying the earth. The soil bore faint impressions that had not quite been erased. Someone had stood there for some time. Not pacing. Waiting. Waiting was important. A little farther along, Mrs. Ellis appeared, clutching her shawl tightly. I thought I might find you here, she said with a conspiratorial air. Everyone's talking. About the roses, Miss Marple said. About the argument, Mrs. Ellis corrected eagerly. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. Arguments are common. They bloom even in winter. This one was not, Mrs. Ellis said. It was late. After dark. Voices raised. Whose voices? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Ellis leaned closer. That's the thing. No one agrees. Some say it was Mr. Phelps. Others say a woman. Miss Marple nodded. And what do you think? Mrs. Ellis hesitated. I think there were 3 people. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. Why 3? Because the shouting stopped too suddenly, Mrs. Ellis said, as if someone else had arrived. Someone who did not need to raise their voice, Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is often the most persuasive sort. Mrs. Ellis lowered her voice. Afterward, someone was seen smoothing the ground near the gate. Smoothing suggests regret, Miss Marple said. Or caution. Yes, Mrs. Ellis agreed eagerly. And then this morning, she paused dramatically. And then, Miss Marple encouraged. They found something, Mrs. Ellis whispered. Near the gate, Miss Marple did not react outwardly. Found what? Mrs. Ellis glanced around before speaking. A ceiling stamp. Old, with a crest. Miss Marple felt the final piece settle more firmly into place. That is a very personal object. Yes, Mrs. Ellis said. It belongs to a family no one likes to mention. Miss Marple's expression remained kind. Belongings have a way of wandering when their owners are uneasy. Mrs. Ellis nodded vigorously. It was taken away quickly. The vicar did not want a fuss. Fusses grow when ignored, Miss Marple said gently. As they parted, Miss Marple continued her walk, her thoughts unhurried but precise. An argument. A third presence, ground smoothed deliberately. A ceiling stamp misplaced and retrieved. These were not random disturbances. They were corrections. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Miss Grant at the inn, under the reasonable excuse of returning a borrowed sugar bowl. Miss Grant received her with professional warmth that wavered only slightly. Such a surprise, Miss Grant said. Do come in. The inn's sitting room was quiet, the fire burning low. Miss Marple noticed at once that the mantel clock sat slightly askew, its base no longer flush with the wood. Someone had moved it recently. You keep things very tidy, Miss Marple observed. I try to, Miss Grant replied. Guests notice these things. Yes, Miss Marple said. And hosts notice when something is out of place. Miss Grant's smile tightened. Did you need anything? Only conversation, Miss Marple replied. It is a pleasant afternoon for it. They sat. Tea was poured. Miss Grant's hand trembled just enough to send a ripple across the surface. People are saying strange things, Miss Grant said too quickly. About the rose garden, Miss Marple raised her brows faintly. People often do. They exaggerate, Miss Grant continued. It was nothing. A disagreement. People disagree all the time, yes, Miss Marple said. Though they rarely smooth the ground afterward. Miss Grant froze, just for a moment. You noticed, she said. I noticed patterns, Miss Marple replied gently. And corrections. Miss Grant swallowed. I do not know what you are implying. Nothing, Miss Marple said kindly. I am merely listening. Miss Grant exhaled slowly. The village is restless. Because someone keeps stirring it, Miss Marple said softly. Miss Grant's voice dropped. Some things should stay buried. Then one should not write reminders, Miss Marple replied. Miss Grant's eyes widened. You think the letters are connected? I think, Miss Marple said calmly, that the argument in the garden was not about the past, but about control of the present. Miss Grant's composure cracked slightly. You misunderstand. Do I? Miss Marple asked gently. Or do you fear being understood? Silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable. Miss Grant rose abruptly. I have work to attend to. Of course, Miss Marple said, rising as well. One must keep things running smoothly. As Miss Marple left the inn, she noticed something glinting briefly in the light near the doorframe. A faint impression where an object had been pressed repeatedly. Round, decorative. A ceiling stamp left its mark even when absent. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at Mrs. Linton's, where conversation flowed politely and eyes darted constantly. The rose garden was mentioned more than once, always with laughter that did not quite convince. Mrs. Linton leaned close. "You've heard about the argument." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "They say it was about money." "They often do," Miss Marple said. "And that someone threatened to reveal something," Mrs. Linton continued. "Something written down." Miss Marple nodded. "Writing makes people brave." Mrs. Linton lowered her voice. "Do you think someone is trying to force a confession?" Miss Marple considered this. "I think someone is trying to force obedience." Mrs. Linton shivered slightly. "That is worse." "Much," Miss Marple agreed. As the evening ended and Miss Marple walked home beneath a clear sky, she felt no alarm, only clarity. The rose garden had not merely witnessed an argument. It had been chosen for it. A place of beauty stripped bare. A public space pretending to be private. Someone had confronted another. Someone had lost control for a moment. Someone else had arrived to restore it. At her gate, Miss Marple paused, listening to the quiet village. She thought of the sealing stamp, pressed into wax to close letters that should never have been written, of the ground smoothed carefully to erase hesitation. The messages were no longer hidden. They were being enforced. And as Miss Marple went inside and closed the door gently behind her, she knew that the careful author of the letters was growing impatient. The village was no longer being reminded. It was being directed. Chapter 7. The first sound Miss Marple heard that morning was not the postman's step, but the careful absence of it. She noticed the silence while pouring hot water into the teapot, the way one noticed a clock that had stopped ticking. The village had learned to anticipate the post with a sort of gentle impatience, and when it did not arrive on time, people spoke of it at once. Silence, Miss Marple had long observed, made people restless. It was nearly half an hour later than usual when footsteps finally approached her gate. The postman did not whistle. He did not linger. He slid the letters through with unusual care, as though the act itself required thought. Miss Marple waited until the kettle had finished singing before she retrieved them. There were only 3 items. A circular from the grocer. A neatly addressed envelope from her cousin. And beneath them, placed not quite straight, another envelope. Miss Marple did not touch it at once. She stood very still, studying it from a distance. It was smaller than the others. Plain. No stamp. No return address. Its placement was deliberate enough to be noticed, but not so obvious as to invite comment. Someone had learned restraint. At last, she picked it up. It was addressed to her. Not in the careful, formal hand she was accustomed to seeing, but in the same practiced script she now knew too well. The writing had steadied since the first letter. The confidence was unmistakable. Miss Marple carried it into the sitting room and placed it on the table beside her teacup. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she poured her tea, stirred it properly, and sat down. Only then did she slide a finger beneath the flap. Inside was a single sheet, folded once. The paper was the same faintly scented stock she had encountered before. Lavender again. Familiar now. Comforting to the wrong sort of person. The sentence was brief. Precise. It referred to an event that had not yet occurred. A time. A place. A certainty. Miss Marple read it twice, then folded the letter neatly and returned it to the envelope. Her expression remained calm, almost pleasant, but something had shifted behind it. This was no longer rehearsal. This was instruction. She finished her tea and prepared to go out. The village responded to the morning as though it sensed something was amiss. People lingered in doorways. Conversations paused mid-sentence when Miss Marple passed. She caught fragments of speech, careful and incomplete. They say another has arrived, not posted. Hand-delivered. Bold, that is. Miss Marple walked toward the church at her usual pace, neither hurried nor slow. Near the lich gate, she saw Mrs. Carter standing with Mrs. Green, their heads bent together in a way that suggested excitement rather than concern. When they noticed her, they straightened at once. "Good morning," Mrs. Carter said brightly. "Out early." "So are many people," Miss Marple replied. "It gives the impression of purpose." Mrs. Green laughed nervously. "Well, one likes to keep busy. Busy can be useful," Miss Marple said gently. "It prevents reflection." Mrs. Carter's smile tightened. "Have you heard?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "I have received something." Mrs. Carter's eyes widened before she could stop them. "You too." "Yes," Miss Marple said calmly. Mrs. Green shifted. "What sort of thing?" Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "The sort that expects to be believed." Mrs. Carter laughed too quickly. "People do enjoy drama. They enjoy control more," Miss Marple replied. There was a pause. Mrs. Carter cleared her throat. "Well, I must be on my way." Miss Marple watched her go, noting how she turned toward the church and then thought better of it, altering her path at the last moment. Inside the church, the air was cool and faintly scented with polish. Miss Marple moved slowly down the aisle, her steps echoing softly. Near the front, Mrs. Wainwright stood arranging flowers, her movements stiff. "Good morning," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Wainwright startled, knocking one stem against the vase. "Oh, Miss Marple. I did not hear you." "People rarely do when they are thinking hard," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Wainwright forced a smile. "I am trying to finish before anyone else arrives." Miss Marple glanced toward the choir loft. "People are expected." "Yes," Mrs. Wainwright said. "Later." Miss Marple did not comment. She merely took a seat and waited. It did not take long. Miss Grant entered first, her expression composed, her eyes darting briefly toward the loft before settling on Miss Marple. Mr. Phelps followed, his manner unusually restrained. Mrs. Carter arrived last, her smile fixed, her movements deliberate. They gathered near the front, speaking quietly, exchanging pleasantries that did not quite mask their tension. Miss Marple observed them with gentle interest, as though they were characters in a familiar play. At a certain moment, Mrs. Carter cleared her throat. "Well," she said, "since we are all here." Miss Marple looked up. "Indeed." Mrs. Carter's gaze flicked to her. "You received it too, I imagine." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "This morning," Mrs. Carter exhaled. "Then we are agreed. This has gone far enough." "Agreed on what?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "That whoever is doing this must be stopped," Mrs. Carter said, "before matters become public." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "They already are." Miss Grant folded her arms. "You do not understand." "I understand quite well," Miss Marple said gently. "You are being guided," Mr. Phelps frowned. "Guided?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Letters that arrive when they are meant to. Notes placed where they will be found. Arguments staged in chosen places. This is not chaos. It is direction." Mrs. Carter laughed sharply. "That is absurd." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Or is it merely uncomfortable?" Silence settled. Miss Grant spoke then, her voice low. "You cannot prove anything." Miss Marple rose slowly. "Proof is an interesting thing. It is often less important than understanding." Mrs. Carter's composure began to fray. "You think you know everything?" "No," Miss Marple said kindly. "Only patterns." She reached into her handbag and removed the envelope she had received that morning. She did not open it. She did not need to. "This letter," she said, "was not meant to frighten me. It was meant to position me." Mrs. Carter's eyes flashed. "Position you for what?" "For observation," Miss Marple replied. "You expected me to attend this gathering. You expected me to notice who arrived first, who arrived last, and who appeared relieved when they did." Miss Grant's face paled. "You cannot know that." "I know because the letter told me," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Wainwright gasped. "It told you?" "Yes." Miss Marple replied. Of a meeting arranged under the loft. Of a conversation intended to settle matters. Mr. Phelps shifted. That proves nothing. It proves intention. Miss Marple said. And intention is everything. Mrs. Carter's voice rose slightly. You are twisting things. No, Miss Marple said gently. I am untwisting them. She moved toward the choir loft, her steps steady. The others hesitated, then followed, drawn despite themselves. At the top, Miss Marple paused beside the wooden rail. This is where the first reminder was written, she said calmly. The scrap hidden in the book referred to this place. It was chosen because sound carries differently here. Words echo. They linger. Miss Grant swallowed. Why here? Because you believed it private, Miss Marple replied. And because you believed no one would question a meeting connected to the church, Mrs. Carter laughed bitterly. You are very clever. Not clever, Miss Marple said. Attentive. She turned to Mrs. Carter. You wrote the letters. Mrs. Carter stiffened. You have no proof. I have repetition, Miss Marple said. The same phrasing, the same scent, the same careful hand. Miss Grant shook her head. Anyone could have copied it, yes, Miss Marple agreed. But only one person practiced until the writing steadied. Mrs. Carter's voice trembled. You do not know what you are accusing me of. I know exactly, Miss Marple said gently. You believed you were owed something. Silence. Security. Control. And when you feared losing it, you wrote. Mr. Phelps spoke sharply. And what of us? Miss Marple turned to him. You were useful. You were positioned. Each of you was given just enough information to move where you were meant to move. Miss Grant's eyes filled. She said it was for our own good. Mrs. Carter snapped. I said it would protect us. Protection achieved through fear is not protection, Miss Marple said calmly. It is coercion. The sound of footsteps echoed below. The vicar's voice carried faintly upward. Mrs. Carter's composure collapsed. You do not understand what would have happened. I understand very well. Miss Marple replied softly. You feared exposure. You feared old truths resurfacing. Mrs. Carter laughed weakly. And you think you can stop it? Miss Marple's gaze was steady. I think you already have. Mrs. Carter stared at her. How? Because you wrote the final letter too soon, Miss Marple said. You revealed confidence where uncertainty still existed. You exposed yourself. Mrs. Carter sank into a chair. It was meant to end today, it has, Miss Marple said. The others stood silent, the weight of understanding settling over them. Miss Marple descended the stairs slowly, the group following. At the bottom, she paused. The village will decide how to proceed, she said gently. It always does. Mrs. Carter whispered, You will tell them. I will allow the truth to appear, Miss Marple replied. As letters do. As Miss Marple left the church, the bells began to ring, their sound clear and unavoidable. She walked home beneath the open sky, her thoughts calm, her conclusions firm. The second letter had not arrived first by accident. It had arrived to force an ending, and Miss Marple knew, with quiet certainty, that the careful author of these messages had just written her final line. Chapter 8. The village woke that morning with a curious stillness, the kind that felt arranged rather than natural. Miss Marple noticed it at once as she stood at her window, watching the familiar lane lie empty longer than it should have done. No one hurried past with a basket. No doors opened with their usual confidence. It was as though the village itself had paused, waiting for permission to continue. Miss Marple poured her tea carefully and sat down, allowing the quiet to settle around her. She had learned long ago that conclusions arrived best when one did not chase them. They came of their own accord, arranging themselves neatly when the mind was calm enough to receive them. She did not have to wait long. There was a knock at the door. Hesitant, but determined. Miss Marple rose and opened it to find Mrs. Carter standing stiffly on the step, her hat perfectly placed, her eyes too bright. "May I come in?" Mrs. Carter said. It was not a question so much as a formality. "Of course," Miss Marple replied kindly. "You are quite expected." Mrs. Carter paused, just for a fraction of a second, before stepping inside. That pause told Miss Marple a great deal. They sat opposite one another, the teapot between them like a mediator. Mrs. Carter did not reach for her cup at once. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap with deliberate neatness. "I suppose," Mrs. Carter said lightly, "that you believe you have everything worked out." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Belief is not required when understanding has arrived." Mrs. Carter laughed. A brittle sound. "You make it sound so simple." "It usually is," Miss Marple said gently. "Once one stops looking for excitement and starts noticing habits." Mrs. Carter's gaze flicked toward the writing desk in the corner. Miss Marple noticed. "You have been very busy," Miss Marple continued calmly. "Writing, practicing, revising." Mrs. Carter's smile faltered. "You have no proof." "I have patterns," Miss Marple said. "And patterns tell the truth even when people do not." Mrs. Carter exhaled sharply. "You think I did all this alone?" "I think you believed you were alone," Miss Marple replied. "That is rather different." Mrs. Carter leaned back. "They would have destroyed everything." "You do understand that, do you not?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I understand fear. I do not excuse what people do because of it." Mrs. Carter's composure cracked slightly. "You did not know him. You did not live through it." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But I have known many like him. And many like you." Mrs. Carter's eyes flashed. "Then you know he deserved to be forgotten." "People do not deserve to be remembered or forgotten," Miss Marple said gently. "They simply are. It is what the living do with memory that matters." Silence stretched between them. Outside, a door opened somewhere down the lane, then closed again as though the village were testing its voice. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and removed several items, laying them on the table one by one with quiet care. An envelope, a scrap of paper, a torn receipt, its jagged edge unmistakable. Mrs. Carter stared. "You have been collecting." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Collecting what was already scattered." "You cannot prove I wrote them," Mrs. Carter insisted. Miss Marple nodded. "Then let us speak of how they were written." Mrs. Carter stiffened. "The paper," Miss Marple continued, "purchased quietly, on a day when the shop should have been closed. Chosen deliberately for its age and scent. Lavender, a habit you once mentioned with some pride." Mrs. Carter's lips parted, then pressed together again. "The handwriting," Miss Marple went on. "At first, careful but uncertain. The impression beneath the ink revealed practice. Repetition. Someone teaching their hand to be convincing." Mrs. Carter's gaze dropped to the table. "The placement," Miss Marple said. "Never random. Always where it would be found by the right person at the right time. The postbox near the church. The mantel clock at the inn. A library book passed quietly between hands." Mrs. Carter's shoulders sagged slightly. "They were meant to listen." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and to obey." Mrs. Carter's voice rose. "You make it sound cruel." "Control always sounds reasonable to the person exercising it," Miss Marple said gently. "Especially when it wears the costume of protection." Mrs. Carter laughed weakly. "I was protecting myself. And manipulating everyone else," Miss Marple added softly. Mrs. Carter stood abruptly, pacing the room. "You do not know what they threatened. The past has claws." "It does," Miss Marple agreed. "But you fed it." Mrs. Carter stopped by the desk, her hand hovering over a drawer before she caught herself. Miss Marple noticed. You kept the tools close, Miss Marple said. Paper, pens, the sealing stamp. Mrs. Carter turned sharply. That stamp proves nothing. It proves ownership, Miss Marple replied. And habit. She rose and moved closer, not confrontational, merely present. You lost it near the rose garden during the argument. Mrs. Carter flinched. That was an accident, yes, Miss Marple said. So was the argument. But what followed was not. Mrs. Carter's voice dropped. I had to correct it. The ground was smoothed, Miss Marple said. The stamp retrieved. The story adjusted. Mrs. Carter's breath came unevenly. They would have spoken, eventually, Miss Marple said. Which is why you escalated. Mrs. Carter laughed bitterly. You sound as though you admire the logic. I admire clarity, Miss Marple replied. And yours was very clear. Mrs. Carter sank back into her chair. I did not intend for it to go so far. No one ever does, Miss Marple said gently. They intend to stop just before consequence. Mrs. Carter stared at the torn receipt. The shopkeeper should never have kept that. She did not, Miss Marple replied. She tore it in fear. That was enough. Mrs. Carter's eyes filled, though no tears fell. And the others, they were guided, Miss Marple said. Not innocent, but not the author. Mrs. Carter gave a hollow laugh. I thought I was so careful. You were, Miss Marple said. Which is why the mistake mattered. Mrs. Carter looked up sharply. Mistake? Yes, Miss Marple replied. You wrote to me. Mrs. Carter's mouth opened, then closed again. You could not resist, Miss Marple continued. You wanted a witness who could not be dismissed, someone whose attention would lend weight to the ending you planned. Mrs. Carter whispered, You were meant to see it my way. And instead, Miss Marple said kindly, I saw you. There was another knock at the door. This one was firmer. Miss Marple did not move at once. She looked at Mrs. Carter, her expression not triumphant, only calm. The village will not be kind, Mrs. Carter said. No, Miss Marple agreed. But it will be honest. She opened the door. Mrs. Wainwright and Mr. Phelps stood together, their expressions grave. Behind them, Mrs. Grant lingered, pale and silent. Miss Marple stepped aside. Please come in. They entered slowly, the room filling with the quiet weight of understanding. Mrs. Wainwright spoke first. She admitted it. Mrs. Carter did not protest. She said the letters were meant to keep us silent, Mr. Phelps added. To keep you useful, Miss Marple corrected gently. Mrs. Grant's voice shook. She said it was for our own good. Mrs. Carter closed her eyes. I said many things. Miss Marple looked at each of them in turn. You were all chosen because you cared about appearances, because you feared disruption. That made you vulnerable. Mrs. Wainwright covered her mouth. We let it happen, yes, Miss Marple said, but now it has stopped. Outside, footsteps gathered. The murmur of voices rose, tentative but growing. The village had sensed the shift. Mrs. Carter stood. Will you tell them everything? I will tell them what matters, Miss Marple replied. The rest will arrange itself. Mrs. Carter nodded slowly, as though accepting a verdict already reached. Later, when the house was quiet again, Miss Marple sat alone with her tea. The village had spoken. Not loudly, not cruelly, but firmly. Decisions had been made. Futures altered. She looked at the envelope addressed to the forgotten name, now lying empty on the table. It had never been about that name, she reflected. It had been about control. About someone believing they could decide which truths were allowed to exist. Miss Marple rose and placed the papers carefully into her drawer, not as trophies, but as reminders. Villages survived not because they were innocent, but because they learned. As evening settled and the lamps glowed warmly behind curtains, Miss Marple returned to her window. Life resumed its gentle rhythm. Doors opened. Voices returned to normal pitch. The pause had ended. The letters would not come again. They were no longer needed. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that the quietest dangers were never the words written on paper, but the hands that believed they had the right to write them. The village returned to its habits slowly, as though testing each one before trusting it again. Miss Marple noticed how greetings grew warmer over the following days, how conversations resumed their gentle wanderings, and how people once more allowed themselves to speak without weighing every word. Relief, she reflected, was not loud. It arrived quietly, like a chair being set back in its proper place. The letters were no longer discussed, though their absence lingered for a time. Miss Marple understood this well. When a disturbance passed, people preferred to believe it had never been real, only a misunderstanding given too much attention. She did not correct them. Lessons learned too openly were rarely remembered for long. On a calm afternoon, Miss Marple took tea by her window and watched the postman pass without pause or hesitation. The rhythm of the village had found itself again. The church bells rang as they always had, no longer signaling tension but time itself, steady and reliable. Miss Marple smiled faintly, not with satisfaction, but with acceptance. Truth, she knew, did not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it appeared as a simple understanding shared without words, a balance quietly restored. She folded her napkin, set her cup aside, and rose to tend her garden. New shoots were already showing where old stems had been cut back. It pleased her. Growth followed honesty, just as surely as silence followed deception. And in that ordinary, peaceful moment, Miss Marple felt certain that the village would remember, even if it never spoke of it again.